Go. Hey, what's up, guys? It's Richard here, back with Cosmic Human Design. Today, I have a very special guest who was actually one of the main inspirations behind Cosmic Human Design, and that's Athen Chimenti, who is a True Sidereal Astrologer, and he kind of coined the whole midpoint between constellations as the dividing line between signs. And he has the site masteringthezodiac.com, which you can go to and get a free True Sidereal natal chart, which I do highly recommend. It's one of the things that really kicked off like this little spiritual awakening I've had lately. And so I highly recommend that. So yeah, let's get into it. So Athen, you, speaking of spiritual awakenings, I read on your site where you kind of went through this big spiritual awakening of your own back in 2011, and you studied all these esoteric metaphysical things, and eventually you came out of it, wanting to, make a living out of astrology, and then later on you developed True Sidereal Astrology. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, or when you first started questioning the tropical system.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Richard. So yeah, that's, I was very scientific person before all of this, in the sense that you could never convince me of anything like astrology prior to that awakening. So I really do attribute that to just becoming more aware that there's more to life than what we see. Before that, I was on the camp where everything had to be verified by the five senses, very objective kind of reality kind of a thing. But I started to get into Eckhart Tolle, very good meditation teacher, Western meditation teacher. So I just started meditating as a thing towards personal development and growth. But for about a year of that, and then especially just one day around the solstice of that 2011, it was kind of crazy. I just had this peace, this just clarity, this awakening, if you want to call it that, of just everything, just the beingness of life, that everything's connected in consciousness and everything. So especially after that moment, I just started diving deep into all kinds of esoteric stuff. But it was the astrology stuff that stuck out to me the most, probably because of my more like scientific background, in the sense that it's very verifiable, So I do obviously believe like tarot cards and all these other mediums are very valuable, but this one just stuck out to my personality because you could go verified, and it's actually scientific in a sense that it is where everything is. Having said that, though, of course, I was into tropical when I first started. So, soon after that, after hearing about a full moon supposedly being in, what they say, Gemini, I think, I got my smartphone. I went outside, I checked it on my phone, and sure enough, it was in Taurus. And so I always knew a sidereal existed. I was always into astrology too. Like my aunt was into it and stuff. So I was always like interested in it. But it really clicked that, why are we not using the actual visible sky, right? And so from that moment on, it just didn't feel right doing the tropical anymore. And I was already doing astrology on YouTube and stuff at that time. And I just shifted everything into the True Sidereal, which represents the visible sky from that moment on. But ever since then, everything's just become more accurate, super accurate for people, and for myself, obviously, too. And since then, I've been using it in my work.
That's great. And I didn't even know that you read Eckhart Tolle. He's actually one of the people that my audience will know this. I talk a lot about the cosmic I Ching, and they actually mention him a lot in that book, and his whole notion of the pain body. I don't know if you've heard of that, and that being kind of identical to the ego. This ego, and I know you talk a lot about the ego yourself. So that's very interesting. I didn't even know that. So maybe you could just really quickly describe to people like what exactly True Sidereal Astrology is, and especially your brand of True Sidereal Astrology, because I do tend to think yours is the most accurate that I've seen so far.
Yeah. So, a quick Google search on sidereal. Well, I guess not now that my website's up and stuff, but typically a normal search for sidereal is going to yield the equal sign sidereal, right? So, for example, the Vedic form of this sidereal, which doesn't use the actual size of the constellations, they do use the sky, but they simplify all the signs into an even 30 degrees each to fit within the sort of calendrical system, make it easy. Especially, it was only up until recently with computers that it became somewhat even possible to do something like true sidereal. Now, mind you, you could always just go out and look at the sky, but like as an astrologer, it's like, you're creating these charts, and before the computers, it was by hand. So, far more complicated to do that with the true sidereal. So it makes sense why they simplified it and everything, but most true sidereal is using the 30 degrees for each sign. And, since the, past, a couple decades, there's been the true sidereal, what they call astronomical sidereal or 13 sign sidereal. But unfortunately, even those are using what are called the IAU boundaries, as you know, which were boundaries created by an astronomical community. So it's the International Astronomical Union. And so their intention was never to use that for astrology. Their intention of creating the IAU boundaries was to give sizes to the constellations, but not relative to the ecliptic. So in other words, these constellations wrap out top of the ecliptic. They're different sizes on top than they are next to it and stuff. So the whole thing is fine for, astronomical purposes. But once you try to apply it to something like astrology, which is primarily concerned with the ecliptic, which is the path of the sun and the planets, then those sizes and everything don't match. So for anyone who's compared the IAU boundaries with the actual sky using, charting software like a planetarium, like, Star Chart or Stellarium or something, they'll see that they don't match. So once I, with the IAU, it's like, okay, those aren't matching. So what I did with my system is I used a planetarium software to do what I call the midpoint system, which is just taking the midpoint between the last star of a constellation and the first star of the next, relative to the ecliptic. It's very important, relative to the ecliptic. So if you take that last star of a constellation, you draw a line straight down across the ecliptic. You take the first star of the next constellation, you draw a perpendicular line straight across the ecliptic. The midpoint between those two lines is the boundary that I'm using. So, it's not like the even 30 where everything is very precise, because this is all visible. So when you look up at the sky and there's a planet somewhere in between both constellations, visibly it looks like both. And visibly it should be considered a blend of both. And that's why even especially with my system, anything within 3 degrees of that boundary should be considered a blend. Having said that, though, the midpoint does a great job of giving you that visual representation. So when a planet is closer to a constellation in the sky and you would see that visibly, you would see that in the chart, as well. So it's essentially just a system of trying to replicate the visible sky into a chart form using that midpoint system.
Yeah, and the midpoint, it seems like a really logical, common sense metric to delineate those constellations. So
yeah,
and I found it to be incredibly accurate myself. So what is your opinion on there's lots of other types of sidereal astrology, with all these different Ayanamsas, which is basically, well, maybe you could explain a bit about what an Ayanamsa is and talk about your unique Ayanamsa.
Okay, yeah. So Ayanamsa it comes from the Hindu astrology, which is just it's just the name for where we begin the zodiac. So because up until, like I said, just the past couple decades, we were always using this even 30 degrees for all the signs. So within the Hindu or Vedic community, there was always conflicting ideas on where the sign should start. In other words, where the beginning of Aries should be, because everything else is 30 degrees. So that's where there's only contention, is where it starts. So there's always different Ayanamsas, right? So the thing is, though, is because these constellations are different sizes in the sky, almost, if not all of the Ayanamsas you're going to find in a software or online are actually inside Pisces. So they don't actually start like in the system I use, which is halfway between Pisces and Aries. Almost, if not every single one, it literally starts inside Pisces. And that's because Pisces is a very large constellation. Aries is very small. So in order to make up for that large Pisces energy, they give more weight to Aries, right? So they started inside Pisces, for example. So yeah, so that's just saying where do they want to start it and then apply that 30 degrees. With the system I'm using, we still use the Ayanamsa because the software requires it. It's basically just asking, okay, where do you want to start Aries? And then from there, you can give it a certain number of degrees for each of the constellations. So the Ayanamsa that I use in my software is, again, right in between Pisces and Aries. For those who've used the software, it'll say 0 to Aries, or 0 to Aries 45. Sheraton, which is beta Aries. It's the what I'm using as the star to reference that. It's just what I'm referencing. So I'm just saying that 2 degrees and 45 minutes from that star, beta Aries, is where I started. But it's basically just in between Pisces, the last star of Pisces and the first star of Aries.
Okay, cool. And yeah, and beta Aries, that's just one of the the first stars in Aries, right?
Right, that's the foot, the very beginning.
So a lot of people have been asking me, kind of like which astrology is more accurate. Specifically, you're wondering about tropical versus true sidereal. And yeah, I saw in one of your videos where you talked about how tropical was still accurate. How you can like make this chart of a chart and it still be accurate because astrology itself is inherently has information for us. And I believe you said something like tropical astrology could represent perhaps the physical facet of our being, of our personalities. So yeah, maybe you could go into a little more detail about what you meant by that exactly, and how that would kind of manifest perhaps in someone's life, or when tropical would be the most accurate.
Yeah. So with astrology, we always cast charts of charts. I mean, it's just a thing we do, right? Like we have what are called progress charts, which we use for predictive purposes. But it's not how things are now, right? It's progressed. So we do some calculations. So it's not uncommon to use what I call derivative charts, which are charts derived from the original chart, whatever that is. So that's how I view tropical astrology. I view it as a derivative chart from the actual stars or from the true sidereal chart itself. So derivative charts, like I said, are super helpful, but they're only showing you one facet or one piece of the puzzle, right? They're not showing you the fundamental layer, or it's a level, it's a derivative, so it's just a part of it. So because tropical bases everything around the seasons, the derivative chart itself is basically saying, okay, instead of referencing the sky, we're going to reference the seasons, meaning they're going to say no matter what year it is, that when it's the beginning of spring, we're going to make that where the sun's in Aries, right? So the beginning of Aries, right? When it's the spring equinox, boom, that is the beginning of Aries. So that's almost 2 signs different. Now, I mean, it's about 24 degrees, depending on how you calculate that, but up to 2 signs difference now because of precession, which we can talk more about that, but that is basically the slow changing of the stars relative to Earth. That with tropical, it's the same thing every year. It's very cyclical. It deals with the sun and earth, so it's very physical, right? It's cycles, it's material, it's cycles, and it's seasonal, so it's very physical. So that's how I view it, and I think that's what it shows, especially the sun sign. I think that the tropical sun signs tremendously accurate, because it's basically just saying that you were born during the season of Aries or of Taurus. So there's an association there that the beginning of spring is associated with Aries, because that is the beginning of the zodiac. And so everything has that pattern in life. But once you start to look at things outside the sun, I think that's where things really start to fall apart, in my opinion. So the moon sign, for example, or the other signs, for example. But still, nonetheless, I think even with the other planets, it still is showing the more physical experience for the individual. Yeah, that's how I would classify it.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. And so just to be clear on precession, so that's kind of where the sun won't return to its same position, the next year as it was the year previously, and that rate of change is about 1 degree every 72 years, right?
That's right.
And by now, since astrology was invented like 2,000 years ago or something, we're off by like from the actual stars, we're off by like at least like a whole sign almost now, right?
Right. Yeah. 20, depending, because we're using the actual size of the constellations, it just depends on what constellation you're referencing. But yeah, it's about 24 degrees depending on how you do it. But because there's some constellations that are so small, like Libra, we can have something in Virgo in the true sidereal system and then be in Scorpio in the tropical system. So that can actually skip a sign sometimes. But yeah, precession is just that. It's that the sun is not coming back to that same place. What's interesting is that, so like you were saying, about 2,000 years ago, they were somewhat matched. So it was around there that when the sun was physically entering Aries, it was the beginning of spring. It just matched that way. It just happened to be that way. So it made sense at the time, 2,000 years ago, when tropical was created. It made sense to just simplify everything and just say, okay, instead of doing all these precession calculations, which are changing, having to factor in this change of the stars, let's just set everything around the seasons and make it very simple and easy. And I think that's what the intention was. I don't think the intention was to remove it from the visible sky. The problem is that we've continued to use this, what I consider an outdated system of setting it to the seasons and not taking into account precession, which the Hindus did, by the way. So the Vedic astrologers did factor in precession, but the West did not. And we can go into theories as to why that might have been. I personally think that the elites, and there's some control things going on there with that to keep the people kind of at bay. But nonetheless, at the time, it made sense. And now, though, with precession, like you said, 1 degree every 72 years, 2,000 years, we're about 24 degrees away from where it was at that time. It's very different now. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to be clear on a certain point, so this, for example, Aries is not necessarily associated with the spring, right? Even though in all of these, a lot of esoteric systems, Aries is like thought to be associated with the spring. It's kind of like built into the archetype almost on this like cultural level, but there's not an inherent, connection between Aries and spring, right?
That's correct. Yeah. Some people would say that actually Aries should be attributed to the solstice, because that is technically when the ending of the solar cycle is and the beginning of the new solar cycle, right? Because so the winter solstice specifically, but depending on which hemisphere you're in, right? So it's the winter solstice where things end in terms of the sun being at the lowest, part of its cycle, and then it starts the new cycle. So technically, you can make the argument that Aries should come out of that solstice time, and then you would have more of like a Cancer kind of energy for the spring, which is the first quarter energy, which deals more with grounding and implementing things and taking action. Yeah,
cool. I've never actually heard that before, so that's interesting. So
I'm personally conflicted on that. I mean, I think you could see it either way, because spring is in a sense the beginning as well. But again, here we're talking about the physical, right?
Yeah.
Because the solstice, the winter solstice is spiritual. So the spiritual new beginning is from winter, right? We're more inward. It's more about, spirituality, reflection, and then slowly starting the new year. Whereas spring is definitely, physical time that everything's growing, everything's coming to life. So you could see it from the physical as Aries in spring, and maybe spiritually Aries in the winter solstice. Yeah.
Cool.
And keep in mind, you would have to have two different systems for the north and the south, right? So what would be Aries for the northern would be, Libra for the southern, and vice versa. So
yeah, that's something a lot of people don't really think about. Like according to like seasonal like astrology, the like half of the world will be using like the opposite of that.
yeah. Yeah, a lot of people that find my work are from the southern hemisphere, because to them it obviously doesn't make sense, because it's fall for them. So there's they're like, why is it Aries if it's fall? Right. Now some tropical astrologers will change, to give credit, some tropical astrologers will change the chart so that if you were born in the southern hemisphere, they will associate that spring with Aries. Okay, so do keep that in mind.
Okay.
And that's what I'm saying is if you do use a seasonal system, you do have to factor in both hemispheres for different times.
Cool. So other than like procession, and accounting for that, another big change in true sidereal as opposed to tropical is the incorporation of 13th sign, 13th constellation of Ophiuchus. Um, so why is Ophiuchus included exactly?
Why is it included?
Yeah.
Because it passes through the ecliptic.
Okay. And all
So
the other signs, constellations also pass through the ecliptic.
With the exception of Aries, which is extremely close. So the feet of Aries don't technically touch the ecliptic, but if you look at the sky, it's the only constellation you would attribute with that part of the sky, because no other constellation is that close. So by definition, what makes a sign, what makes a constellation a sign, is that it has to be at least very close to the ecliptic, to where it appears that the sun is moving through that constellation.
Mm-hmm.
So with Ophiuchus, it's extremely obvious that it should be considered a sign, because it literally passes through the ecliptic. So by definition, it doesn't have to pass through the ecliptic, but it does. And so that gives it even more weight that, why isn't this 13th sign used? Why was it removed? Because it's obviously a sign by definition.
Yeah, and maybe there's something about where the ancient astrologers, they really wanted to have 12 12 signs, only wanted to have 12 signs in the zodiac, because 12 is a number that goes into 60, and 60 is the basis of the clock, and timekeeping, and 12 months in the year, the calendar, and all this stuff, which astrology has very much always been historically associated with. So yeah, do you think that had something to do with it? This whole like number thing?
Yeah. But to again give credit, Scorpio and Ophiuchus do share the same part of the sky. So I totally understand that if they're going to create a simplified system, to just remove Ophiuchus, it makes total sense. Like you're saying, 12 is just a very easily divisible number. Mind you, it was the astrological clock that came before the calendar. That's where we get the 12 months from, right? So when they were first creating calendars, they were using obviously the sky, but they needed everything to be nice and even. So it makes sense for a calendar to make everything 30 degrees. Doesn't, to me, make sense to do it astrologically when you want to see where everything actually is. But if you're just trying to make simple timekeeping, it makes sense to make everything at even 30 degrees, and to also give it 12, because with a 12, you can divide it by 4, you can divide by 3, you can divide by 2. It's just much more symmetrical, right? Whereas 13, like where's the half of 13? Like, you really can't do that. So that's why I think they did it. So, now we're talking like 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, with the invention of calendars, that they basically simplified the astrological constellations into the even 12 that we see. And then from there, astrology started to use that. But I firmly believe that before the calendar system, so 5,000 plus years ago, we were using the visible sky. I mean, I don't see why we didn't. We were going outside and looking up at the sky, at the campfire, telling stories and stuff based on where everything actually was. So I think it was, all of this more simplified system kind of happened in steps as the West primarily simplified everything to make everything fit into a nice, even man-made system. It started first with calendars, and then it took form with the tropical we talked about 2,000 years ago. And so today we're left with this very basic, very symmetrical system that doesn't represent the actual sky anymore.
Mm. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, and I wanted to ask you a little bit, about this. Just to play on that point a little bit. I feel like True Sidereal very much is kind of almost a common sense thing. It very much makes sense that, to me at least, that we should be using an astrology that aligns more with nature, right? And actually represents the planets where they actually are in the visible sky. And I mean, when someone reads that they have, for example, like their sun in Aries, they expect that their sun is actually going to be in Aries. And I've met so many people who are very surprised that, that's not the case in tropical astrology, including myself. um, so, uh, so yeah, do you think that True Sidereal is going to spread a lot more once more people like kind of realize that, and that becomes more widely known?
Yeah, no, and it is thanks to the internet, so and computers that allow us to be able to do that with the charts. But yeah, no, the trend's definitely up. If you do Google searches for sidereal astrology, you'll see a steady uptrend over the past 5 years at least. Same with True Sidereal and stuff. So it definitely is the future. I think the problem is like you said, people just don't know. They just don't know. When like I said, first started astrology, told me I was an Aquarius. I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm definitely an Aquarius. That's where the sun was, right? I just believed it because, I don't go outside. We live in these, boxes, and, we're not really connected to nature much. I mean, some of us are, and, that I think is the ideal, but we're not. And so we just don't know. A lot of people just don't know. And I think the more people become aware of that, the more obviously we'll see this adopted. Now, there are people, of course, that because their parents use tropical or they're raised with tropical or they just identified themselves so much with tropical, some people, are adamantly against it or just not open to it. And so that'll always be that way. But with new generations and everything, I mean, it just to me makes total sense. I think obviously there'll be a bit of a hybrid, I'm sure. Like I said, the tropical sun sign's accurate. I think it's great to know your tropical sun sign. But once people become more aware of the fact that we're not using the actual sky with astrology, once they know that, most of us do the research and maybe check out that new chart and then pass that on to the next generations.
Yeah, totally. I think that's definitely going to happen. And so, and kind of getting into last few questions here. One of the you alluded to earlier about the possible reasons why tropical has been so promoted, or has kind of just been the system for so many thousands of years now, really. And one of my theories is kind of like that tropical astrology, or any astrology, has the potential to create kind of this a global consciousness field, where if enough people believe in that astrology, or that's what they've been told, even if you don't believe in astrology, and if you don't follow astrology, you're going to be encountering people all the time who do, and that's going to affect your perception of them and your perception of yourself. So Yeah, do you think that astrology has the potential or the capacity to create kind of um, a global consciousness field? And in the case
Yeah.
of tropical, perhaps a skewed consciousness field, or even a false consciousness field?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, on an individual level, our perception is insanely powerful. Our beliefs, our view of life, our perception pretty much dictates our reality. Now, I'm not saying that you just believe anything, it's going to become true. We are, of course, limited to the Saturn side of it. So the Jupiter side is, beliefs and perspectives. That's half of the equation. The other half is the objective physical world. But that half of perception is extremely important to manifesting our reality on an individual level. And then, so if you go Jungian and you see that we have a collective consciousness, then same thing. If the collective consciousness believes something, we all share that. We're all part of that. Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty profound. Um, so yeah, I think that's all the questions I had for you today. I know you've got to go here in a minute, but yeah, a lot of my audience is going to be really excited to hear you talk about True Sidereal, and it's kind of it's kind of been the backbone of what I'm doing, cosmic human design, and it all really hinges on the astrology. That's where all of these calculations I've done come from, and you know you could even view human design as uh, kind of a form of astrology even. So I think it's very important that we get this right, and are clear and have clarity about what's actually the right astrology to use.
Yeah, totally. And I love what you're doing. I mean, I think it was totally been needed with human design is, yeah, incorporating the actual constellations.
Yeah, and a lot of people have said that actually they've said that they experienced a similar reaction that they experienced when they first encountered your site and first looked at their true sidereal chart.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like that power transfers over, because of the astrology, which is really cool.
Yeah,
But
totally.
so thanks so much, Athen, for being with us today, and
Thanks for having me.
hopefully we'll get to talk to you again pretty soon and collaborate more in the future.
Awesome. Sounds great. All right, Richard. Thank you again.
Thank you.